Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode, which looks at the trade relations between India and ASEAN. India and ASEAN have emerged as critical economic actors on the world stage. Together, they represent a significant portion of the global economy, with their combined GDPs exceeding 7 trillion US dollars. Today, this relationship has also turned into a dynamic partnership with cooperation expanding across several sectors. And within these, trade is a critical sector of discussion. Uh, the trade has surged from $52.6 billion in 2010 to over $130 billion today. Yet there are some challenges which persist and within this sector. India faces a mounting trade deficit, while ASEAN seeks greater consistency in India's trade policies. Delhi's claim is that the source of this growing trade deficit with ASEAN are the Chinese exports which are routed to India via ASEAN, while ASEAN remains frustrated with India's growing protectionism. To unpack this complicated trade relationship, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Evelyn Devadason, professor at the University of Malaya. And I'm glad that she can join us for this podcast at a very opportune time when we're seeing a lot of disruption and uncertainty in the trading world itself. So, Dr. Devadasan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Syed, for having me here.
To start off our discussion, I would like to just present a question which helps us set the context. How would you characterize India and ASEAN trade relations, and what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this trade partnership?
I think this topic is timely because India is the focal point of ASEAN now. Uh, India is still India is still very much a peripheral player to ASEAN. If you look at the data, in ASEAN accounts for 11% of India's global trade, but India only accounts for 3% of ASEAN's total trade. Now, that tells you the relative importance of ASEAN to India relative to the other way around. So that is one. And the deficits, as you have rightly pointed out, they are huge. They've increased more than fivefold from 2010 to the current present, where the deficit stands almost at USD 44 billion. Now, having said this, India at the moment has limited engagement in regional supply chain. So very often people ask, to what extent can we build our relationship with ASEAN? Because ASEAN's trade is characterized by the density of electronic supply chain. But if you look at the data, over the period 2010 to 2020, GVC trade has only increased by 1.3% of total gross exports between India and ASEAN. But when you dissect that data and you look at forward participation, it has definitely grown by more than 4% over the past decade. And why is this so? Because India provides business process outsourcing services, or in short, we call it BPOs, which include your software services, your call center services, which are and mostly in ICT products. So there is some kind of difference in terms of the prospects that India can offer to ASEAN, because what we see within ASEAN is more backward participation in global value chains or regional value chains. Whereas in the case of India, especially India's engagement with Singapore involves forward participation. The third sort of like characteristic or feature that I would see between India and ASEAN is that, which is very interesting in terms of the kind of shifts that we are seeing geopolitically, is that India some of them call it a middle power, is also an independent in the sense India has a non-aligned or multi-aligned approach similar to that of ASEAN. We do not want to align ourselves with any particular party, though everyone knows that ASEAN's supply chains are quite China-centric, but we still want to give that narrative or spread that narrative. We are taking a non-aligned approach, and that's the same with India, which is a multi-aligned approach. And what's telling is that the recent McKinsey data, when they actually kind of investigated what is the geopolitical distance indicator for key economies in the world, it was very interesting to find out that ASEAN and India, the geopolitical distance remains stable over the recent period of 2017 to 2023. Remain stable, meaning that their trade continues to open a broad geopolitical spectrum. And this sits very well with ASEAN because they would want to also engage with a partner that has a non-aligned approach so that they don't become the focal point of the United States. So this sort of sets the background of the kind of engagement, that India and ASEAN, or the plus points that India and ASEAN have that can move forward this partnership to greater heights. Now, in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, if I could actually put into perspective the weaknesses first, why is it that India is still a peripheral player to ASEAN? The first thing you note is the high trade costs between the two parties. Now, these trade costs, they have reduced over time, but they remain exceedingly high, suggesting that the regulations in both countries are highly different. Now, what kind of regulations am I talking about here? This relates to non-tariff measures. The product standards in both countries, especially in key traded products between the two, pharmaceuticals, food products, and electronics, they are quite wide and different. Now, this lack of harmonized standards actually results in high trade costs. And if you look at the latest ASCAP World Bank database, you will see in the context of India's trade with all bilateral ASEAN member states, it is high, but let me take an example of Malaysia and India. On average, for tradable agriculture goods, the additional costs involved in trading internationally between Malaysia and India is about 164% of the value of the goods compared to when the two countries trade internally. So here I'm comparing the case of when you trade across borders, then when both countries trade within borders, the trade cost is so much higher. But what if we were to compare with another key trading partner of ASEAN? Here you'll find that the cost of agriculture traded goods between Malaysia and India, they are subject to an additional ad valorem tariff equivalent cost of 30%, also for agriculture goods in comparison to Malaysia-China trade. So definitely, high trade costs is one key challenge in this partnership. And our own study showed in 2021, if you look at the non-tariff measures and drill down to the details, you'll find that the regulatory distance is even higher, surprisingly, for pre-shipment inspection and other formalities. Now, this is quite unique in the sense that one would expect trade costs to be higher for technical measures such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures and also technical barriers to trade. But the reverse happens in the case of ASEAN and India. So this needs some verification. What could be wrong with customs procedures? Are they burdensome? Are there delays in clearance, customs clearance? So this is another aspect that contributes to the high trade costs. Now, the second challenge I would think goes back to my initial comment that there is limited engagement of India and RVCs, but the positive aspect to this, just like in the case of trade costs, the positive aspect to this is that you can reduce the costs. There are unexhausted trade potentials that can be derived provided you reduce the cost. Likewise, in the case of limited engagement of India in regional value chains, the upside to this would be if one could actually harness certain supply chains. So if you look at India's engagement in value added, it differs across the ASEAN member states. For example, with Malaysia, it has grown at 3.4% for chemicals, yeah, India's global or regional value chain participation with Malaysia. With Indonesia, it's grown by 3.2% over the last decade in pharmaceuticals, and then about 2.2% for automobiles and parts and engines with Thailand. So there are some sectors where it has grown, but it is still, the increase is still very much marginal. But what's interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, India being a leader in global service value chains rather than goods has much to offer for ASEAN through forward participation. And if you look at the details, India creates now 7% of global value added, where 4.7% comes just from BPOs, yeah, as I mentioned, yeah, and it's just slightly behind that of China. So the kind of engagement that we can see with India would be more through forward participation, which offers something different from what the way in which ASEAN is engaged with China. And the final weakness that I would like to point out is, besides the limited engagement in RVCs, the high trade costs, is the lack of alignment between trade policies and industrial policies. Now, this is not specific, yeah, to the India-ASEAN partnership, because it's everywhere. Today, we see the rise of industrial policies. They call it the Industrial Policy 2.0. Now, what's happening is that trade policies and industrial policies need to work together to facilitate trade. If you have tariffs, very high tariffs, let's say in the case of India, to protect its agriculture sector, but at the same time, you're trying to engage in supply chains through food processing, because India is the second largest food processor in the world, then it will be difficult because there's a misalignment between the two. So this is where trade policies and industrial policies need to work together. Same in the case of Malaysia. If you, or even ASEAN, if you have registration procedures that are very complex and burdensome to register certain drugs or pharmaceutical products, then you are actually not facilitating trade. And if you have certain import protectionism policies in place through your broad framework of industrial policy, then you will also have some kind of misalignment. So this misalignment is not just in terms of goods trade, it's also in terms of digital trade. That's why you see the rise of what OECD calls today as digital protectionism, because in not only is there trade in goods, there's also trade in services, which are actually growing at a much faster pace. And when we talk about digital trade, there's also data flows. So countries are also coming up with digital protectionism, which is a new form of industrial protectionism, not from an industry perspective, but from a data perspective. So they call it digital protectionism, where countries are actually regulating data flows to sort of build domestic capacity in digital intensive sectors. Now, if this is the case, there's even going to be greater misalignment for digital trade. So there's a fine balancing that needs to be done here. Let's say in the case of digital trade, you cannot let free flow of data flows, but you need to balance data flows with data privacy. But to what extent are both parties willing to offer certain commitments? That has yet to be seen.
Thank you for this very informative and nuanced outlook of what is a complex trade relationship. And you've highlighted the challenges and strengths very well. And this kind of brings me to my next question, which is on the key agreement within this trade domain, which is the ASEAN-India Trade and Goods Agreement. And this is now in the process of review. So how can this review address India's concern of a growing trade deficit with ASEAN?
Probably I'd like to start first by saying that sometimes there's too much of preoccupation on trade deficits. As mentioned earlier, services has been growing. So one has to factor a kind of cooperation between goods and services, sort of like an inter-industry. And here it's not even inter-industry, it's intersectoral exchange. I'll come back to that point in a bit. But before that, since you mentioned ITIGA, ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement, which is coming up or which is being reviewed. Now, this is timely because if you look at all ASEAN plus one FTAs, there is underutilization of ITIGA, and ITIGA represents the lowest level of market opening commitments among most of the ASEAN plus one FTAs. So this review is timely because if ITIGA is to be effective, then this agreement should actually offer broader access and favorable provisions. So the first thing I would like to stress about, if India were to look at this review to address some of its growing trade deficits, how could it go about the negotiations with ASEAN? Now, one would be to ensure that this time around, the reviewed agreement encompasses better measures of trade facilitation, especially in terms of rules of origin. I understand that there has been some circumvention and some concerns regarding circumvention of rules of origin. So probably the rules of origin need to be looked into in terms of the documentation. Why is there some circumvention? In terms of non-tariff measures, as I mentioned earlier, it's always not the case of the non-tariff measure per se, because non-tariff measures, unlike tariffs, they are not tangible and they are opaque. So they are packaged with certain conformity assessment procedures like testing, registration, sampling, certification. So these conformity assessment procedures tend to diverge. And in the case of ASEAN and even the broader Asia Pacific, they have been flagged to have high trade costs in terms of those conformity assessment procedures. Why? Because it goes back to the implementation. We can make life difficult for exporters or importers by having burdensome procedures for them to just register a particular product. So this is where ITIGA or the ITIGA review should also consider coming up with certain MRAs, mutual recognition agreements, where we recognize and accept some of these conformity assessment procedures of another country as equivalent to ours to avoid double, let's say double testing or double registration, and facilitate trade for businesses, make it easier, make the procedures easier. So the first thing I would see is the focus should be on facilitating trade. The second I would think is, I mean, it may not be a mandate in the review, but I think certainly it should be taken up that the ITIGA review considers further market openings through specific sectors. So sectoral cooperation here is important. Now, in this case, India could negotiate for tariff reductions in ASEAN, but particularly in the sectors where India has a competitive advantage, which is none other than pharmaceuticals and textiles. But in return, India must or should propose some phased reductions of tariffs. I say phased because tariffs in the agriculture sector is considered highly sensitive. So some phased reductions of tariffs on sensitive agricultural products to move forward market openings and market commitments both sides. So in this context, one would say commitment and integration is important for both sides, not just for India to address its deficits, but commitment and integration in terms of making some domestic reforms, especially when you want to sign mutual recognition agreements or have any loose kind of cooperation on mutual recognition standards, then you should actually be committed to do some domestic reforms. And here the reforms, I mean, streamlining the procedures in your own home country before you bring it to the table to actually negotiate and come up or see how you can streamline across borders some of these measures, procedures, or conformity assessment procedures. So commitment and integration are important, yeah, to upgrade or or to open up the market. But at the same time, the most important thing is reciprocity. So in the case of further market opening, reciprocity will be very key for both sides. If India wants to gain more access for its pharmaceutical and textiles, it would be also important for India to open up its agriculture sector. So that is one way I look at further market openings. So the first point which I mentioned was to actually facilitate trade with the existing ITIGA and then to upgrade and open up the market for new sectors, for collaboration in new sectors. The third point I'd like to emphasize, how they decide on where the collaboration should be. I think one way to identify collaboration opportunities both sides would be to look at complementary industrial policy instruments. I mentioned earlier there has been a misalignment between industrial policy and trade policy. So I think it's important to look at where or which areas do both policies kind of complement. Let me take an example, the ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025 and Digital India 2015. Two different industrial master plans, one for the ASEAN bloc and one for India. Digital India 2015 is for India. Now, they are in some ways aligned, yeah, because they involve enhancing digital infrastructure, boosting e-commerce, and strengthening cybersecurity. So maybe here they could look at within semiconductors, or if you want to call it digital products, where in which could they foster new supply chains or engage to ensure greater resiliency in some of these supply chains. So I think identifying the complementary industrial and trade policies is kind of like a low-hanging fruit to move forward in terms of identifying new areas for collaboration. Otherwise, you'll have grappling with their domestic industrial policy, which is not within your control. Let's say, Make in India, which offers some kind of import duties and protectionism for its homegrown industries, and trade policy, which seeks to push those similar sectors. You will have problems in meeting or finding a middle point between those two diverging policies. Yeah. And finally, if I could comment on ITIGA, it kind of surprises me in today's world when we see the bundling of trade in goods with services and data, where services is becoming so important for goods. And here I'm not talking about services, trade in services in the form of tourism or health or education. I'm talking about services in the form of the supply chain, where you need business process servicing, services such as consulting, consumer service, software services. So in terms of these services, it's difficult to disengage goods from trade. The distinction between goods, trade, and even data has been blurred over time. So it's surprising to see the ASEAN-India partnership having different agreements. So while your question is on ITIGA per se, I would just like to draw some concerns when you have a separate goods agreement, services agreement, and investment agreement, but there's an interplay between the three agreements. It's hard to push for cooperation, because what's happening here is India is being a global leader in IT and business process outsourcing services, has much to offer for ASEAN, even within the semiconductor industry, even within advanced manufacturing, such as with Singapore. So you need to package both of it together. And in the case of Singapore, if you look at it closely, what's driving that kind of engagement, forward participation in ICT in Singapore, it's actually foreign direct investment. So this becomes even more complex. You actually have to sort of link goods, services, and investment. So this is something that needs to be thought about. But although the reality is only ITIGA is up for review, but I think this is something that ASEAN and India could think about in future in terms of packaging all three, services, goods, and investment together.
I think the point you raised about the misalignment of trade and industrial policy is quite interesting, and you demonstrated it quite well with the digital policies of both countries. And I do want to continue along this line of conversation because we see that the current geopolitical environment does give kind of an impetus for two countries in the ASEAN and India to capitalize on the shifts away from China in the global supply chains. So, between India and ASEAN, what kind of cooperation do you think we're seeing, and what kind of complementarities between these two regions support for such economic cooperation?
The focus has been, globally, regionally, the focus has been on resilient supply chains. And what we see is the current geopolitics. Everyone talks about de-risking supply chains away from China because, especially in the case of ASEAN, where our supply chains are all China-centric, what kind of cooperation would I see in terms of India and ASEAN in this front? Okay, I would think that in terms of resiliency of supply chains, India is integrated into ASEAN's regional supply chains, except I would think in the case of Singapore. In the case of Singapore, the focus has been on developing resilient semiconductor supply chains because they have already moved ahead of the rest of ASEAN and signed an MOU on India-Singapore semiconductor ecosystem partnership, and they're looking to move ahead in advanced manufacturing. So they can speak about resilient semiconductor supply chains. But what about the rest of us? The rest of us, we have not come to that stage of development or that stage of engagement in terms of resilient supply chains. So I would think the kind of cooperation that we may see may not just be supply chains alone. And this has been raised recently, that the focus has been too much on supply chains, or rather diversification of supply chains. What about diversification of export markets vis-a-vis diversification of supply chains per se? Now, this you can actually look at in the case of Malaysia. We were having problems to export palm oil, and last year we diversified our markets, and surprisingly, Malaysia's exports of palm oil to India increased substantially by 14.5% last year alone. So it's more of diversification of markets for some of us, not just diversification of supply chains. The supply chains with India possibly will take a bit of time. What are the other kinds of cooperation I would see? I think one of it I mentioned just now, Said, in terms of Singapore, is actually investments driving FDI. This is something ASEAN needs to think about because the supply chains are not established well enough. But in the case of Singapore, they have moved ahead, and they have moved ahead with investments. So investments precede supply chain establishments or the development of supply chains. So investments flow into the region both ways. So I think this is something the rest of the ASEAN member states need to think about, how we can actually harness investments between ASEAN and India. Third, I always have this feeling it's very difficult to think regional. ASEAN as a bloc is very diversified. And if you see cooperation between a bloc and India may sound feasible through ITIGA, we have a lot of frameworks and so on, but is it practical? So this is where you see sub-regional cooperation. The third kind of modality of cooperation would be sub-regional cooperation. And this kind of cooperation involves boosting trade and connectivity because for some countries, such as Thailand and Myanmar, connectivity or infrastructure may be more important, may be more of a pressing need to boost trade. And this is why we see India, Thailand, and Myanmar with four other Bay of Bengal nations, they have actually inked a maritime transportation agreement. So they are looking at connectivity together with trade. Singapore is looking ahead of moving their semiconductor supply chain system or the whole ecosystem through investments. That's a different kind of cooperation. And the rest of us, I think we are looking to some extent in intensifying our bilateral engagement. India and Thailand, for example, signed 6 agreements recently for cooperation in IT, maritime, handicraft, and so on. So it's a kind of a mix of different modalities of cooperation between ASEAN and India. So the geopolitical shifts, one kind or one type of cooperation wouldn't work for ASEAN as a bloc because the region comprises different countries with different strategic considerations, different outlook for their economies that will drive the kind of cooperation that we're going to see between individual ASEAN member states and India. In terms of complementarities between the two parties, yeah, I think it would be best to look at specific sectors. And here, if we consider just in a general context, the complementarities in this partnership are actually very much inter-industry. If you look at within ASEAN, it's intra-industry. So inter-industry exchanges sort of drive both regions closer because we are trading essentially different products, or even you can say products for services. So across sort of completely different sectors. But if we go down to the products per se, in terms of electronics and green products, now there's been a recent classification to sort of look at the semiconductors from a digital perspective, because you can have digital products within semiconductors, you can have physical products within semiconductors. So looking at this area, we find that in the case of electronics, ASEAN has been increasing its export shares of semiconductors and to some extent, or I would rather say limited extent, lithium-ion batteries to India. But India in turn has been sort of exporting environmental goods and low carbon technology. So they're quite different. We are trying to engage with India through physical digital products, and in some cases, physical electronic products, and in some cases, digital products. In return, we're importing a bit of green products or low carbon technology. So the complementarities here come about because of sort of different products altogether, what we say inter-industry exchanges. But in terms of other products such as pharmaceuticals and medical devices, we import a lot of generic drugs from India. ASEAN imports a lot of generic drugs from India. What kind of collaboration or complementarities could we see in this area? It could be rather different. In the case of Malaysia, for example, we are looking to collaborate with India in terms of getting India's technical expertise to combat or to help us establish AI applications in our healthcare system, because we don't look at drugs per se as an industry. We consider it now as an entire healthcare industry, drugs plus the medical devices. Malaysia is already positioning itself to be a medical device hub for the region. Yeah? It houses over 200 medical device manufacturers and 30 MNCs. So our drawback is we do not have the expertise to look at data governance, data flows within these medical devices, which house a lot of patients' data, and privacy needs to be maintained. So how do we actually govern such data flows? So we are looking at complementarities, I would rather say cooperation from India, who's a leader in IT services, AI applications, to help us to actually govern data. So in the case of pharmaceutical medical devices, it would be probably bilateral engagement through technical expertise or capacity building initiatives, which are quite different. In the case of services, I've already mentioned earlier, we are looking at India to provide its forward participation through BPO in services. Yeah, and this is also very timely because if you look at the ASEAN model, it's also shifting. It's shifting towards a service-oriented model because more than 50% of our trade in services is digital. Is that of digitally delivered services, and India is considered an agriculture and services sector economy. So there are some complementarities there because ASEAN is also moving towards services. So I see complementarities in terms of specific sectors, E&E and green products. I see it in the services sector because we need BPOs. I see it in the pharmaceutical and medical devices sector because we need technical capacity in data governance. We also need technical capacity in combating counterfeit goods, especially pharmaceutical drugs that go through online platforms which are illegal. These are considered illicit online pharmacies. We are unable to actually control them, and we are also unable to track down this counterfeit medicine. So all this requires a lot of capacity building. And of course, complementarities in terms of markets for products such as palm oil, which actually faces a lot of problems in the EU, market access problems in the EU. So the kind of cooperation could be very diversified with the EU. It will not be a specific sector. It would also not be just in trade in goods. It will involve goods, services, and a lot of technical expertise.
Thank you for that answer. And I think since we are talking about trade, the conversation will be incomplete if we don't bring up the recent actions by the United States and the recent imposition of tariffs, which is you know, inflicted some disruption in the trading world. And ASEAN has seen a diverse mix of tariffs imposed, ranging from about 10% to 49%. How will the regional dynamics interplay with the responses from individual countries? And I understand this is a big question. Perhaps you can give us like a brief outlook on what you think.
This is an important question, Saeed, but it's also a difficult one, I must say. I mean, the tariffs, I mean, Trump has paused on those tariffs for 90 days. But how will regional dynamics interplay, yeah, with some of those responses? In the sense like, okay, I think the initial position that ASEAN took was, of course, to come up with a unified response, yeah, to counter Trump's reciprocal tariffs. But at the moment now, ASEAN is also gearing up regionally to deepen its intra-regional engagement and also extra-regional engagement. Now, in the case of India and ASEAN, there are a few frameworks. We have an investment agreement, we have ITIGA, we have the services agreement, we have the ASEAN-India strategic partnership. So the frameworks are there, and our engagement with India is guided by these frameworks. But are these frameworks going to push both parties closer together? I really do not think so. I would think at the end of the day, the bilateral ties are rather asymmetric between each individual ASEAN member state and India. They're very different. As mentioned earlier, they're very sector specific. So sometimes bilateral engagements may be more dynamic than regional mechanisms. So I would think the ASEAN member states would move ahead with India on a bilateral perspective. At the regional level, at least when ITIGA is reviewed, they may come with some general commitments, general offerings, and some general consensus would be reached. But in terms of moving the relationship to a higher level, I think the bilateral approach will still be the way to go for ASEAN with India. Because if you look at Thailand, as I mentioned earlier, their focus may be on infrastructure. But if you look at Malaysia, as I mentioned, medical devices is one of the new products we're thinking of. Halal products, another new one. And then products that are considered politically sensitive, so to speak, like palm oil, is another issue for us. So it may differ in the case of Singapore. They've gone ahead. So it may be more on AI, uh, and then becoming an investor hub for Indian companies. So investments may be at the forefront, and they are already the key recipient of investments from India. So it may be quite different. The engagement may be, it just shows you that the engagement is going to be bilateral simply because of these differences between the 10 ASEAN member states.
Before we conclude this conversation, I do want to bring up Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN this year, and perhaps you can comment on how its chairmanship influences its trade relations with India, and perhaps how Malaysia's role as ASEAN Chair in 2025 in influence or will influence the pace of the ITIGA review negotiations.
Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN this year, Malaysia is playing, I would commend Malaysia for playing an active role. It is moving forward ITIGA, because ITIGA is considered one of the priority economic deliverables or PEDs. But Malaysia has an ambitious plan. Having said that, Malaysia has an ambitious plan. Immediately, our Prime Minister was looking to craft a unified regional response, to Trump. Now they have that Trump has paused those tariffs for 90 days. They're still going ahead, but the message is very clear that we need to become more resilient, because there are so many uncertainties here on how the US is going to move forward after the 90 days. So they have got various issues on the agenda, one of which is boosting intra-ASEAN trade and investment, fostering digital transformation. Besides ITIGA, ATIGA is up for upgrading, the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. And we have, I think, the true test, besides ITIGA, the true test for Malaysia being a chair this year would be to conclude substantially the negotiations on ASEAN Digital Economy Framework, or DEFA, Digital Economic Framework Agreement. That would be the true test for Malaysia. And the third one is Timor-Leste's accession to ASEAN. And of course, China is visiting Malaysia this month. The Premier is visiting Malaysia this month. And he will definitely, I believe, would push for the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement, RCEP, simply because it's one of the key players in that agreement. So definitely China will push for that. And Malaysia realizes that ASEAN alone is quite a small bloc, but with these additional players like China, who's already key to our supply chains, they are looking at RCEP as a focal point to deepen regional integration instead of just focusing on the narrow ASEAN. But in the case of India and ASEAN, keeping aside all the other issues which are on the agenda for this meeting on the next Malaysia-ASEAN's chairmanship this year, I would think Malaysia's role would be, or Malaysia's plus point would be, it has to some extent mapped out some clear timelines for ITIGA's review. And one of the things that I note is in the timeline is they actually had scheduled for the negotiations to be concluded latest by mid-2026. But interestingly, our Malaysian International Trade Malaysian International Trade Investment and Industry, they have actually announced that they're going to push to try to conclude it by the end of this year. So this accelerated negotiations regarding ITIGA is something that sends out a clear signal that Malaysia is quite serious in engaging with India. And they are really all out as an extra regional partner, and they are all out to push these negotiations and conclude it substantially by year end. And they've been having frequent meetings in this regard, technical level dialogues and so on. The second thing I thought was really important is initially when you read they talked about ITIGA, the initial discussion or debates or narratives on ITIGA and its review. They were more focused on sort of increasing trade facilitation. And over time, it evolved to think about ITIGA in a more modern sort of modernizing the scope of ITIGA. So this is another plus point, and Malaysia has taken up this method to modernize the scope of ITIGA, realizing that ITIGA is underutilized. So this is another second plus point. So how they're going to go about modernizing ITIGA is to include digital trade. So you may think like, okay, this is directly, it's not linked to physical goods, but it complements physical goods. It supports physical goods, e-commerce trade, because you could also buy online and get the goods delivered physically. So they're going to modernize digital trade in terms of e-certification, trying to move towards e-certification, paperless or digitize some of these procedures. So modernizing the scope of ITIGA, I think, is very important to make this agreement relevant, because you're competing with other ASEAN Plus agreements, and this agreement has already been flagged as being underutilized. So I think that's another good plus point in moving ITIGA forward and concluding it substantially and effectively, yeah, I would say. And the third is enhancing trust and transparency. There have been concerns from both sides. I think from the ASEAN side, the concern, of course, is the high tariffs on agricultural products in India. The other concern is from the India side is the complexity in the registration procedures for pharmaceutical products, and also the concerns of circumvention of rules of origin. So I think the kind of discussions and dialogues that they're having to one extent is to also enhance trust. Trust is something that is so important for trade, may seem trivial, but it is definitely important when you talk about digital trade, because you have a lot of data flows, data privacy issues. Trust is very important when you want to build partnerships. Trust is very important when you want to offer certain commitments from both sides and make sure that it's a win-win situation from both sides. And they're going about it very well to enhance trust and transparency, and also to be very, I would say, inclusive, because a lot of these barriers do not come from the governments. The barriers need to be forwarded by the businesses. And they've also a milestone, yeah, in one of their reviews or their events that are forthcoming, that is to engage the private sector and get their private sector input on barriers within electronics and pharmaceutical products. So that is really important, because that input will be really valuable for to eradicate some of these barriers. You may not be able to eradicate all barriers. You cannot eradicate non-tariff measures. They serve a public policy objective, but you can streamline some of the procedures that support those NTMs. And all this can only come from the private sector, because these are minute details that governments will not see, because the regulation is there, the measure is there, but the actual problem of trading comes from the private sector. So on those grounds, I would say Malaysia has been doing pretty well to date to actually move ITIGA forward, and to also ensure that ITIGA this time around, the reviewed agreement is effective, comprehensive, and the provisions are much broader than the initial ITIGA.
I think an important takeaway from this entire conversation is that it will be an interesting year to look out for trends in India-ASEAN trade relations. Dr. Devadasan, thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation, and I think this was a very informative and insightful session.
Thank you so much, Saeed, for the opportunity to share.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.